try and set this up a little bit before I plunge in here. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a roadmap, or maybe a hydrologic map of where I want to go, or what I want to do today. And so really my basic argument here is that China's contemporary water challenges are historically embedded. And when I mean contemporary water challenges, I'm probably going to assume that you have some familiarity with the notion of contemporary water challenges, but in short, China is experiencing and has been experiencing some severe water quantity and quality challenges over the last couple of decades. And my goal here is to argue that those challenges, those quantity and quality challenges, are not necessarily problems that just arose during the reform period, a term that I'll come back to in just a moment here, but are instead legacies or outcomes of longer-term historical processes. And so what I'm hoping to do here is that I've been searching, I've been trying to think of some kind of image or metaphor to express my argument. And I think the latest that I've come up with is these nested Easter eggs, I guess. I thought about those nested Russian dolls, but I don't know, those just didn't seem to work and were sort of disturbing in some other ways as well. But in any event, what I'm hoping to kind of illustrate here is that, right, the inner egg here, the smallest egg, is, right, analogous here to the contemporary water problems that China is facing. Okay? But again, those problems are nested or embedded in, right, a middle inner egg, which would be the Maoist era water management, okay, or exploitation. And that itself, right, the middle inner egg is embedded or nested in a longer-term historical context, and that is the 20th century management of water in China. And then finally, all of these eggs, from the contemporary to the Maoist era to the 20th century, patterns in water management are embedded in a much longer run, a longue durée of history, to use the French Annales School notion of a long period of history. These are embedded in imperial patterns, okay, of water management. And so while each of these has its distinctive qualities or its distinctive characteristics, nonetheless, all of them are embedded in a longer-term historical process that frames, that embeds, that nests, if you will, the phenomenon of the contemporary water problems in China. So just as a roadmap here, I'm going to start off with a bit of an anecdote that I hope will explicate, will serve to introduce the kind of contemporary water problems that China is faced with. But then I want to go back and put that anecdote, right, of contemporary challenges in a longer-term historical context through these different historical periods. Okay. I think I need to figure out how to animate these. I mean, if these are working for you, if the nested eggs are working, maybe I'll have. What's it? Okay. Well, in either event, I'll have to have our crack staff in the home office animate those next time for greater effect. Okay. Well, let me. Well, again, as shameless plug here. Many of the themes that I'm going to be exploring are in fact explored in this book published this year. Again, wanting to set the table here, just a couple of housekeeping, I guess, items. I want to situate some things. So this is obviously a map of China and has some of the central features that I'm going to be talking about. And the first of those is the North China Plain, a region called the North China Plain, which, as I'll mention, is a critical agricultural area in China. And it's bounded roughly by three river systems. The first is the Hai River, a relatively short but important river valley to the north. and then running through the central part, or the middle part of the North China Plain, is the lower reaches of the Yellow River. Okay? And then to the very south, bounding the North China Plain to the south, is the Huai River system. Okay? And I will again be focusing on the North China Plain area and paying particular attention to the Yellow River that has been so critically important in defining the topography of the North China Plain. A couple of terms here that I'll be using probably rather often. Imperial China, right? This very long swath of time, formally running from 221 BCE to 1911. I'm going to be again using the imperial period, but I'm likely to be really referring to perhaps the last 1,000 years of the imperial period. Maoist China, I'll use that term a lot. Period here denoting the years between 1949 and 1978. Okay, a period in which economic management was largely organized around sort of this notion of central or Soviet-style central planning or centralized planning. But also during this period, there was a means of social and economic organization that I'll refer to as mass mobilization. And I think perhaps the nature of that type of organization might be obvious from the term, but I think it will be obvious after we look at a couple of slides relative to that. And then the third period post-Mao China is this period, that China is in now, the period of socialism with Chinese characteristics, an early phrase that was applied to this, the Deng Xiaoping era, or market socialism, another term used to denote this period. And again, this is the period in which China opened up its economy to private investment, foreign direct investment, began to engage in a great deal of international trade. Okay? I should mention there's probably another term. Well, I know there's another term I'm going to use. Republican China basically is this period between 1911 and 1949. Okay? In any event, okay? Are we good? Good with all the terms and regions? Another map that I want you just to be quickly familiar with, and this is a map that relates to the anecdote that I'm going to start off with here. And the Jiang River, I want to note here, is a river, relatively small river, part of the Yellow River or the North China Plain, technically a tributary of the Yellow River, and forms part of the border here between the provinces of Hebei to the north and Henan to the south, and a couple of villages. Baishan village, located just to the north of the Jiang River, and Panyang village, a village located in Henan just to the south of the Jiang River. So I'm going to go ahead and, partly because I have my limitations as a public speaker, but partly I want to make sure that I remain within reasonable bounds of time. I'm going to go ahead and mainly follow a script here, but I'll try and pause at various times as well. The hot, dry August of 1992 was a particularly violent period for the farmers of Baishan and Panyang villages. On the afternoon of August 5th, residents of each village hurled insults and explosives at each other across the Jiang River, a river that at that time trickled more than flowed. The emotions of the afternoon were fueled by events of the previous night, when 70 Baishan villagers waded into the river to build a makeshift dam to divert water to their fields. Upon hearing of the treachery, Panyang villagers assembled to drive the dam builders away. Arrayed on each bank, the exchange commenced. 2 days later, farmers from Baishan crossed the river to the Henan side and dynamited shut an irrigation canal that watered the fields of Panyang. According to a front-page article in the Farmers' Daily newspaper that appeared 2 weeks later, party and government leaders were stunned by the acute social disturbance. But some local farmers told the Farmers Daily Reporter that the conflict had been going on for 20 years. Others said for 30. But the farmers also acknowledged that the tensions over dwindling water supply had indeed escalated during the past several years. But before all this acrimony began to build, villagers, in fact, seemed to get along reasonably well. There were dozens of intermarriages. For example, the Panyang Party secretary was the uncle of the Baishan Party secretary. And the director of the Baishan Collective was the nephew of the Panyang Party secretary. This is probably a topic for a whole nother paper. In any event, despite the family connections, however, it seemed that in late 1992, that water ran thicker than blood. So what does this conflict tell us? From 30,000 feet up, probably not all that much that is unique. After all, struggles over water, usually entailing upstream versus downstream interests, are nothing new, either in China or in a host of regions around the world, or a host of countries around the world. But viewed more closely, each of these struggles has its own unique cultural context. The exchange of locally fashioned bombs across the Jiang River in 1992 was indeed a snapshot of a moment and a place that was both destination and point of departure. In other words, the conflict over water resources along the Jiang River lay along a continuum that connects past and present and suggests the parameters of a future trajectory. More concretely, the escalating tensions over water resources on the North China Plain during the 1990s was a consequence of a historical evolution that combined climate, geography, state policies, and social forces. In the early 1960s, the waters of the Jiang River were plentiful. Although a newly built irrigation system siphoned off some 70% of the Jiang River at that time, there was still plenty of water flowing to serve downstream needs. But after the 1980s, the annual flow of the Jiang River decreased significantly. With upstream withdrawals for irrigation and local industry dramatically expanding, downstream competition for water increased. Compounding the struggle over dwindling water supply was drought. The region was suffering the worst drought in 40 years. In the downstream, the river dried up. The upper reaches of the irrigation system also dried up on 8 different occasions. This ecological stress generated economic and social instability, stresses that led to the violence between these two villages in 1992. The story of inter-village dispute over water resources was an early indicator of water stresses on the North China Plain that continued to grow under the extraordinary demand for water unleashed by the remarkable economic growth of the post-Mao era, when China's leaders introduced a series of economic reforms that generated the sorts of growth that we have all become accustomed to over the recent decades. As years of 10+ annual GDP growth came and came again, images of polluted water and dry riverbeds suggested that limits were quickly being reached. A quick survey of some of this data sketches an image. Total water resources declined from 40 billion cubic meters a year in 1956 to roughly 30 billion cubic meters a year in 2000. On a per capita basis, the declines were more stunning. As a consequence of demographic growth on the North China Plain that saw a population increase from 57 million to 133 million in 2009, per capita water availability plunged from 700 cubic meters a year in 1952 to less than half of that, 300 cubic meters in 2009. Compounding the tenuous supply balance of water has been pollution and potentially global warming. For example, in 2009, 1/4 of Yellow River water did not meet grade 5 standard. That is the grade which indicates that water is unfit for human consumption or agricultural use. At the same time, a joint publication by several government and research organizations in China forecast a 27% decline in glacial volume in the Qinghai-Tibet Plateau region and the Himalayas over the next 25 years. As I'm sure many of you know, this region is the water tower of Asia and is the source of many of China's rivers, including the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, as well as transboundary rivers such as the Salween, Ganges, Mekong, Brahmaputra, and the Indus rivers, to name just a few. So my research on China's water is not intended as an expose. Its purpose is not to present a portrait of what others have described as China's environmental train wreck. Nor does my work obsess with violent conflicts like that over the Jiang River, or other shock moments like the drying up of the Yellow River, or the revelations of terribly polluted Huai River water during the mid-1990s. These sorts of books have indeed been written. Instead, the purpose of my research is to explore China's contemporary water challenges from a historical perspective. So, to state this most simply, I attempt to make two fundamental arguments. First, China's current water challenges are indeed historically grounded. To be sure, post-Mao, that is again post-1978, economic boom has unleashed unprecedented urban growth, industrial expansion, and agricultural intensification, all with profound consequences for water resources. But patterns of supply and demand during this post-Mao period have been grafted upon a physical and institutional landscape that was deeply altered during the Maoist period. And both the Mao and the post-Mao waterscapes were and are conditioned by longer-running historical realities and commitments. Second, these historical forces or realities will not disappear. As China necessarily confronts issues of resource allocation, the enduring legacies of the physical setting and cultural choices will shape the range of choices available as leaders formulate options to balance a host of issues that impact national and international interests and constituencies. So let's take a very brief tour of sorts to explore these historical forces that have and continue to shape China's current water challenges. The North China region, the North China Plain region, has long been among China's most ecologically vulnerable areas. The region receives much less rainfall than the south, and when it does rain, it is concentrated during the summer months when powerful monsoonal weather fronts can generate heavy downpours. This variable climate has generated large-scale floods and famines that could be devastating to local communities. The other critical element shaping the human ecology of the North China Plain, of course, has been the Yellow River. The river, or a river that carried massive amounts of silt from its middle reaches and occasionally floods with heavy consequences. So let me try and illustrate. I apologize for this graphic because it really obscures in important ways. So this is a cross-section of the Yellow River in the lower reaches, let's say in Henan, Shandong area. And if I could kind of point out this phenomenon of the hanging river to kind of explore why this was so critical in shaping the geomorphology of the North China Plain. So here's right in this case the South Dike. Here's one of the dikes, and here is the other dike. Okay. So when water is low, I guess, right, the water basically is held between right here. Kind of ignore this, that the shaded areas that come out, here. The water level is right here. But when the water level is high, right, it peaks up towards the top of each dike here. And in fact, well, the other thing I need to point out here is the land here, which again is rather obscured here. But this land, in effect, indicates the level of the land outside or adjacent to the two constraining dikes. So you can see that the water level, even at a low level, is well above the adjacent land. But at high level, when the risk is high of breaking through the dikes, you can get a sense of the power of a breach in the dike, the power that the water can come rushing out here down to the level of the adjacent land and just pour over the North China Plain, okay? And this other image here gives a historical sense of the consequences of this, okay? Of the consequences of the threat of the Yellow River dike breaching its banks, or the Yellow River breaching its banks in the lower portion or the lower reaches of its bed. And so again, historically, the Yellow River has had, right, a variety of breaches here and has sought, lower gradients to discharge to the sea, all up and down this North China Plain region, which in part has made the region reasonably fertile for agricultural pursuits. But the point here being is that this is one element of this very this ecological vulnerability that the North China Plain is subject to. At the same time, this region has long been one of the most critical agricultural regions in sustaining state and empire. Today, the region produces half of China's wheat and 1/3 of its maize and cotton. At the same time, nearly 1/4 of China's population resides on the North China Plain. So this historical combination of highly variable climate, agricultural importance, high population densities, and limited water resources have induced Chinese states to exert considerable effort to maintain some semblance of ecological and social stability by expending massive resources on preventing floods and mitigating the social consequences of famine from both floods and droughts. So as we can see from the example of this slide, the state committed itself at a very, very early period in the early point in the imperial period. The state committed itself to a system of high dikes to maintain or to contain the Yellow River. This commitment was necessary to maintain hydraulic stability in the North China Plain. At the same time, this commitment was a straitjacket throughout history, as the state necessarily had to maintain the necessary investments in both human and material resources to ensure social and economic stability. The state in Imperial China also sought to guarantee social stability on the North China Plain by mitigating economic dislocation during periods of famine by a system of state granaries. These granaries released grain during periods of privation to dampen the inflationary effects of reduced grain supply during periods of famine. Indeed, the goal of ensuring China's food security continues to be a fundamental concern of China's political elites to the present day. So as I've attempted to show with these brief examples, well before the 20th century, there was already a long, long history of state efforts to manage the ecological setting of the North China Plain. Let's turn to a little bit more recent history. How Chinese states in the 20th century have sought to enroll science, technology, labor, and ideology to exploit the resources necessary to rebuild wealth and power is a central issue of modern China's history. For most of the 20th century, the goal of water management in China, as it was in all industrial and industrializing countries, was multi-purpose water management. To political and technical elites in China, and indeed around the world, the Tennessee Valley Authority, right, the TVA, was the preeminent model of multi-purpose management. Industrial development through hydroelectric generation, agricultural development through irrigation, economic integration through expanded waterway transport, and valley-wide economic security through flood control. All of these goals accomplished by storing water behind large concrete dams. Created and sustained by massive planning and administrative bureaucracies, these high modernist visions of the state to map, control, and exploit resources in order to create national wealth were premised in Europe, or at least initially premised in Europe and North America, on a technological complex that included advanced science and technology, capital-intensive inputs, rational bureaucratic organization, efficient labor inputs, and a sustaining mythos of industrial capitalism. These components of this high modernist technology complex were quickly adopted in China during the Republican period, again, that period between 1911 and 1949. Through a variety of technical exchanges and the establishment of technical training institutions in China, multi-purpose water management promised to put every drop of water to productive use. The adoption of multi-purpose water management in China during the 20th century was smoothed, I argue, by a tradition of activist water management by dynastic and local governments during the imperial periods, as we've seen. So after 1949, then, the means to achieve the building of a strong communist China vacillated between the Soviet Union model of large-scale, high technology, centralized control, capital-intensive projects on one side, and a Maoist, for a lack of a better term, a Maoist technology complex that emphasized small-scale, local knowledge, local management, mass mobilization, and self-reliance. Was this hybrid technological complex uniquely Chinese? And ultimately, did it generate unique consequences to China's water resources? So let me try and illustrate these two different kinds of approaches or hybrid approaches to managing water in China after 1949. So here is, I think, kind of a contrasting set of images that may make sense here, right? So here is the Soviet-style multi-purpose water management, a type of management, even though it has perhaps its Soviet characteristics, but nonetheless is largely informed by a multi-purpose water approach that emerged initially in Europe and North America, okay? Large, massive, right? Requiring, as you can imagine, large bureaucratic, administrative kinds of capacities here to move material and manpower, right, to the site here. High technology relative to certainly the image on the right, capital intensive, right, centralized, right, relying on the centralized administrative acumen of the state, okay, right, a type of water management that was predominant in China between 1949 and let's say 1958, okay, looking at this early Maoist period. Well, at other points in the Maoist period, there was a change in emphasis. So, for example, this image on the right here would be an image that would be very true to Great Leap Forward kinds of policies that sought to expand Chinese irrigation on the North China Plain and elsewhere in China in a massive and a very quick way. And this Maoist approach relied upon mass mobilization, right? Human labor, low investment, local management, all designed to take advantage of the resources, human and material resources that were organized, right, as China's rural society was organized on a communal basis. Okay. A couple of other posters from this, at least for the Soviet-inspired type of water mobilization, right? This poster showing, right, or under the caption, "Today's Soviet Union is our tomorrow," right? Be careful what you wish for, I guess would be our response from this point of view. But again, showing the kind of mechanization, right? This I find interesting here. But in any event, the sorts of mechanization and family life, right? This is nice here. That, right, Soviet-style investment was supposed to result in. And here's a specific plan of the Yellow River plan of 1955 that is specifically informed by Soviet-style kinds of outcomes here, or processes and outcomes. A plan that envisioned something like 13 large dams on the main stem of the Yellow River, right? And other kinds of, right, industrial technologies being employed here through multi-purpose water management, again, extracting the productive resources as much as possible, extracting the productive resources from this river. And again, the contrasting ideal here, the Great Leap Forward, emphasis on mass labor organization, recruited, supervised through local political structures, mainly the communes. The other interesting development here during, this came a little bit later, during the 1960s, was the development of groundwater, exploitation of groundwater resources, which were relatively rich in the North China Plain area. It became evident that surface waters were being exploited to such a degree that, right, this impelled local communities to begin exploiting groundwater resources. And the technological component that made this possible were these very simple, either diesel powered or electrical powered motors or engines that were put to a variety of uses in rural China, but they had an enormously significant effect in terms of exploiting groundwater resources on the North China Plain. Okay, I'll come back to that issue again in just a moment. So after 1949, the state also actively engaged in the symbolic construction of water and often adapted more traditional symbols and values of water to serve the building of communism. Efficient and rational harvesting of resources was intended for production for the nation. Indeed, the construction of nation or national identity through production implied the nationalization of nature. The landscape was etched, or perhaps better stated for our digital world, was encrypted with national identity. The writing of the past on the landscape included the retelling of creation myths, of Yu the Great, right? This individual who is rendered here in a couple of different ways. Yu the Great, who in prehistorical times is credited with draining the swamps of the North China Plain by digging channels to lead water to the sea, thereby creating the ecological conditions for the rise of Chinese civilization. This is the original creation story here of Chinese civilization. The landscape was also imbued after 1949 with negative symbolic values of feudalism, imperialist exploitation of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Japanese invasion of China, and the American invasion of Korea. Re-engineering this ugly, right, symbolic landscape of exploitation would lead to a utopian garden of production. This rebirth of the landscape suggested a second creation story of Chinese civilization, precisely in that region where it all began, in the Yellow River Valley of North China. Epic narratives of the People's Victory Canal, the Sanmenxia Dam, which was the first dam across the stem of the main channel of the Yellow River, the Red Flag Canal irrigation system, all of these represented the realization of the ancient saying that when, quote, when a prophet appears, the river will run clear, end quote. Well, that prophet was Mao Zedong. Mao, as the creator of this new landscape, this new civilization, this new China, was the modern you the Great. This conflation of landscape and national identity was employed aggressively by the party to legitimize their claim to rule and to sanction the reorganization of society to, quote, make the mountains bow and the rivers yield, end quote. So what were the outcomes of aggressive water development of the Maoist era? And I'll run through these pretty quickly because I think we're getting bumping up against some time issues here. So the sort of aggressive water re-engineering or the replumbing of the North China Plain, both in terms of surface water development, aggressive development of irrigation, of dams, of exploitation of groundwater resources, right? What were some of the outcomes of this that in effect cast a long shadow over the post-Mao era? Well, some of them was, some of the problems were there was so much emphasis on bringing water to the fields, right? Building dams, creating irrigation ponds, building irrigation channels to bring water to the field, that in the haste of the Great Leap Forward, where much of this happened, there was an inadequate, in some places, in many places, I think it's fair to say, there was inadequate attention paid to drainage. Okay? So that much of the newly irrigated farmland became saline and had to be withdrawn from production. Okay? And the aggressive groundwater exploitation campaign had very significant impact on groundwater levels on the North China Plain. Some fairly early incidences of land subsidence around Beijing and Tianjin and south of there that indicated indeed that groundwater levels had been withdrawn, or that water from groundwater was being withdrawn at unsustainable kinds of levels. But how do we judge this? And this is a central question that I deal with in the book. How do we judge the consequences of this Maoist kind of resource management? On the one hand, China fed its people in the Maoist period. And that was no mean accomplishment, because of the extraordinary demographic growth that China experienced in the post-war era, right? The kind of demographic growth that was experienced around the globe, right, in the post-war baby boom. Okay? But the costs, right? What were the costs of feeding that population? Well, first of all, the population was fed by a massive extension of irrigated agriculture. Okay? What were the costs of that? Well, the costs of massive development of water resources, as I mentioned, left a long shadow over the reform period, when urbanization, industrial development, and further agricultural intensification has meant an even greater call on water resources on the North China Plain, but water resources, right, that already in many ways had been exploited during the Maoist period. So let's turn to the contemporary world. Let's turn to the post-Mao period. As you all know, the extraordinary economic developments in China during the last few decades have generated an enormous demand on resources, both energy resources and water resources in particular, and particularly on the North China Plain. Industrial development, urbanization, and structural changes in agriculture have all resulted in large demands on water resources. Again, water resources, I'll reiterate, that were already aggressively developed during the Maoist period. Under such heavy demand, the Yellow River dried up in the mid-1990s, some 700 kilometers upstream from its mouth. The event caused considerable comment both domestically in China and internationally. Within China, right, the Yellow River having a very, very potent symbolic value as the region of the mother river of China being flowing through the area of the origin, right, of Chinese civilization. Within China, the event spurred a great deal of comment on water. And globally, too, China's resource challenges began to invite comment. In 1995, for example, Lester Brown, from the World Watch Institute in Washington, D.C. Lester Brown aroused considerable attention, again, considerable attention in China as well as worldwide, aroused considerable attention to concerns about China's capacity to feed itself in light of its growing population and shrinking endowments of water. And ultimately, how marginal economies in places like sub-Saharan Africa would be priced out of international grain markets once China was forced to enter these markets in a large way to feed its people because of water and land constraints in China. It's worth pointing out that, subsequently much of the data that Lester Brown used to make this argument was erroneous, but nonetheless he touched a nerve. He touched a nerve both within China and globally about Chinese resource constraints in light of its enormous economic growth. Well, in terms of domestic political and social arrangements, political elites in China are well aware of the potential for social instability that depleted and despoiled resources can engender. State and party leaders are well versed in the examples of former Soviet states where environmental concerns and nascent environmental movements often formed the sharp edge of a wedge of a broader reform movement. All that said, the state in China faces a very difficult balancing act. How to ensure agricultural productivity to feed a large population, how to ensure social stability by allocating sufficient water supplies to rural areas, while at the same time providing for sufficient water to industry and urban constituencies so vital to maintaining China's economic growth. So let me conclude by arguing that in many ways, the broader history of water on the North China Plain is a story of accommodation. An accommodation between imperial patterns of water management and the patterns of modernity. Or as Arnold Pacey, a historian of technology, describes it, a technological dialogue between past and present. The landscape of the North China Plain that was profoundly altered during the Maoist period had already undergone a thorough scape lift by the 20th century. There was no wilderness on the North China Plain by the 20th century, only to be transformed by the forces of modernity that much of American environmental history focuses on. In other words, there was no distinction between natural and cultural by the 20th century on the North China Plain. The landscape had long been made and remade by inundations of the Yellow River, largely as a consequence of human actions. The landscape was further shaped by state policies in the imperial period that sought to manage agroecological constraints with an extensive plumbing and replumbing of the hydrological systems on the North China Plain. These agroecological constraints were a combination of demographic pressures, limited land resources, and environmental threats of either too much water, that is floods, or too little, drought. Maintaining an ecological equilibrium to sustain agricultural communities on the North China Plain was essential to a state during the imperial period that valorized the economic and moral order of these communities. Indeed, legitimacy to rule was often premised on the ruler's capacity to order the waters in imperial China. In addition to controlling floods, such state concerns also led to the large engineering project of the Grand Canal system to extract agricultural resources from the Yangtze River region to the south to sustain the North China Plain. All of these traditional issues of water management in China during China's imperial history, such as ordering the waters, dependence on engineering solutions, and appropriating the resources of the south to sustain the north, all of these were appropriated by the state and party after 1949. So finally, allow me to finish with a brief, but I think powerful example to illustrate how patterns of continuity are still at play today. Just as in the imperial period and much of the 20th century, large-scale engineering solutions to water management challenges remain a powerful attraction to contemporary leaders in China, as is suggested by the determination to complete a massive plumbing project that will transfer water from the Yangtze River Valley to the Yellow River Valley and beyond, the so-called South to North Water Diversion Project, which is illustrated here on the map. The eastern route has presumably been largely completed. Work is going on in the central route. The western route remains in the planning stages because of some very, very complex geography and hydrologic conditions. But what is clearly different, right, is a source of discontinuity in this story is the degree of China's current integration into global networks. As such, China's resource challenges are global resource challenges. As Mark Elvin, a longtime observer of water in China, notes, quote, "In any future impasse that China faces, whether of water or food, the world will either be a part of China's solution or China will become a large part of a global quandary," end quote. So, thank you so much for listening. Appreciate it.